Welcome, everyone. And we're so glad that you could join us for ACSM's April Brown Bag in Science webinar presentation. Today, we are really pleased to have Dr. Avinash Chandran speak about his research around sport injury surveillance. This webinar series is geared to our students and young professionals. Our goal is to provide exposure to the breadth of research that ACSM members conduct. The way it'll work today, Dr. Chandran will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time where Dr. Chandran answers questions. For now, I'd like to introduce Avinash. Avinash is the director of NCAA Injury Surveillance Program at the Datalys Center. Prior to joining the Datalys Center, Dr. Chandran was a Postdoctoral Research Associate in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he concurrently worked within the Matthew-Gfeller Sport-Related TBI Research Center, the Center for Study of Retired Athletes, and the Injury Prevention Research Center. Dr. Chandran is a quantitative epidemiologist, and his research interests are broadly in athlete health over the lifespan. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Public Health from the University of Maryland, College Park, and he completed his Master's in Science in Epidemiology, as well as his PhD in Epidemiology at the George Washington University. We're so happy to welcome Dr. Chandran today, and at this point, I'll turn it over to him for his presentation.
Thank you, Lynette. Hello all, and thank you for watching this webinar on sports injury surveillance and the utility of sports injury surveillance data. Now, as noted, my name is Avinash Chandran, and I'm the director of the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program at the Datalys Center. Now, through the course of this webinar, I'll try to orient you all to the mechanics of sports injury surveillance systems and the type of data that are collected within these systems. I'll then move on to discussing how sports injury surveillance data can be useful in studying injury outcomes in particular, and present an example of time loss and how time loss following sport-related injuries may be studied using data collected within these sports injury surveillance systems. So starting with a bit of an orientation to sports injury surveillance, now, applying the fundamental public health principles to sports medicine, it's clear that scientists and practitioners in this space are ultimately motivated by the primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention of sports-related injuries. Now, with that said, it's important to note that injury prevention in sports is really a cyclical process initiated by the establishment of an injury-related problem, followed by the reconciliation of some etiological frameworks, the introduction of prevention strategies, and ultimately the assessment of these strategies. Now, as we see here, this essentially involves a feedback loop between large sample and small sample evaluations or studies. The large sample studies noted here is really where sports injury surveillance fits in, and data collected by these mechanisms have really changed the landscape of sports medicine research over the past 20 years with a sort of continuous process of monitoring injury incidents. Now, much akin to surveillance in other contexts, sports injury surveillance is also complex and multidimensional. The fundamental idea of surveillance really is to cast a wide net, so to speak, and capture as much breadth as possible on a health-related problem. Now, much like surveillance in other contexts, sports injury surveillance is also constant and continuous and doesn't really rely on predefined study periods. Now, importantly, the main cogs in the machine of sports injury surveillance are the reporters, those who essentially contribute data into the surveillance systems. Now, for domestic sports injury surveillance systems such as the NCAA ISP, the Nation Surveillance Program, or High School Reporting Injuries Online, these reporters are certified clinicians or certified athletic trainers. Now, to briefly give you all a sense of the mechanics of sports injury surveillance systems, we can take the example of the NCAA ISP in particular. In the ISP, ATs participating at participating institutions contribute data by entering records into their clinical electronic medical record systems, or EMR systems. The data are then mapped onto the requirements of the surveillance program, stripped of identifying information, and synthesized into our internal databases here at the Datalys Center. It's ultimately those data that are then used for scientific endeavors and to support the NCAA in health and safety related decision making. Now, importantly, throughout this process, the submitted data are checked constantly for inconsistencies or missing information so that those may be reconciled as they're housed within our internal systems at Datalys. Now, the information captured within sports injury surveillance systems can essentially be classified into what we would consider quote unquote exposure data and injury data. Now, ultimately, they together contain information regarding the number of exposure events, so things like school sanctioned practices and games, and the number of athletes participating in those events, as well as information regarding injuries occurring to those athletes while participating in these aforementioned events. Now, while surveillance systems capture some, much like the ISP, capture some general information regarding the athlete and the context in which these injuries occur, much of the focus is really placed on capturing details of the observed injuries themselves, such as the site of the injury, the specific diagnoses, the nature of the injury, as well as, importantly, outcomes following the injury, such as time loss. Now that brings me to the second section of this webinar. Now, as I just mentioned, much of the emphasis in sports injury surveillance is placed on capturing details related to injuries that do occur, including outcomes such as time loss. Now, as it's probably easy to imagine, time loss following an injury is commonly used and considered an extremely informative indicator of the burden of an injury. So because of that, time loss is the most commonly used outcome in most studies that aim to analyze and characterize determinants of injury severity. Now, with that said, importantly, based on the existing literature, it's important to note that the assessment criteria for injury severity includes multiple components. So the nature of the injury, the pain and discomfort associated with the injury, treatment modalities, limitations to functional capacity, or the disability caused by the injury, and of course, time loss as a result of the injury. Now, arguably, with the exception of time loss, it's difficult to quantify injury severity using any of these other components. And this likely explains why time loss has been historically used to represent injury severity. Now, in practice, the analysis of time loss to characterize injury severity has been based on really categorizing the number of days lost to an injury into ranges which are then assumed to define distinct levels of severity. Now, these ranges are then used to quantify the effects of time loss determinants, so observable factors like, as I mentioned, like games or sex. And the effects of those determinants on severity. Now, this has been useful for identifying factors that are associated with differential time loss due to injury in various sports. However, it's important for us to consider some notable limitations with regards to this approach and the interpretations that come with it. First, the cut points used to classify injuries as quote unquote minor, moderate, and severe in this approach vary across studies. And so there really is no standard definition of severity using time loss cut points such as these. Second, it's also important to note that injuries classified into the same category are then implicitly considered to be equivalently severe, implying, for example, that a 28-day injury potentially and a six-month injury could be classified together and considered equivalently severe, which is unlikely to be true in practice. And third, since the consequences of an injury are generally unique to an individual, it's possible that the timing of return from an injury to differ really for two athletes with seemingly similar injuries even. And so then we start to see some of the problems associated with this historical approach and see that it's perhaps advantageous to consider a more flexible framework or a flexible approach which fully exploits the information available in the data, in the time loss data, by viewing time loss really as an event time. So really time from the point of injury until return. Now, to explain this a little bit further, this figure really demonstrates conceptually how time loss is essentially driven by observable determinants, as I mentioned. So some of the things that we capture, such as game setting or injury site or sex, but also by unobservable determinants, such as latent injury severity. So for similar athletes with similar injuries, observed differences in time loss could partially at least be attributable to the relative or the athlete-specific severity of an injury. To think about this a little bit more, the figure describes how really the breakdown in mechanical energy transfer, which determines injury severity, which firstly determines the injury occurring in and of itself, but also determines injury severity, can be conceptualized as a difference between situation-specific mechanical load and the athlete-specific capacity to withstand that load. As this breakdown is really originally what results in the injury severity then inherently is that delta between that mechanical demand imposed on a localized region of the body and the athlete-specific capacity to meet that demand, and is also determined at the point of injury, whereas recovery is more so an ongoing process beyond the injury. So time loss from an injury then, as we see in this figure, is dependent on both observable as well as unobservable components or determinants. Now, to analyze time loss as it's measured, based on the argument that I've been making here, regression models can be used. Now, typically in scientific practice, regression models are techniques used to identify the expected value of a given variable of interest. Now, in this case, let's say that value or that variable is time loss, obviously. Regression models, which include only the observable determinants that I mentioned before, which would be known as fixed effects, would not account for some of those between those athlete-specific nuances or the severity of an injury. As they assume, essentially, this is because they assume all variability in the observed time loss or the observed outcome is either explainable by the observable determinants or due to unexplainable random variability. Now, in those cases, in the cases that I'm mentioning here, and the approach that I'm mentioning here, random effects are often used to capture unobservable, subject-specific, or athlete-specific, in this case, heterogeneity or variability. Now, one way to practically implement the framework that I've been sort of presenting so far is by considering time loss as a count outcome, count of days lost after an injury, and using what are called random effect Poisson regressions. The model would be structured as it's shown here, and sort of for the purposes of this webinar, sort of skipping over some of the technical mathematical details, see here essentially that TI represents time loss for an individual for whom there are what we would consider P observable determinants that go from Xij to Xip, and an unobserved random effect Zi, which essentially represents the additional heterogeneity and time loss that could be attributable to the severity of a given individual's injury. Now, for interpretation, based on this model structure, the differential time loss for an observable determinant, again, let's say something like sex or event type, is easily computed as what would be considered a time loss ratio, essentially comparing the relative mean time loss across levels of that determinant. So for sex, it would be comparing male to female. Basically, this expresses a ratio between the mean time loss, as I mentioned, again, in 2 groups and 3 groups, however, expresses a ratio. And importantly, based on this framework, the interpretation also accounts for the presence of the unobservable random effect, again, which is used to represent the athlete-specific severity of an injury. Now, it's alternatively possible to also consider time loss as a continuous outcome using an event time, what are called an event time framework, which basically defines the outcome, again, very similarly to the Poisson case, as a time from the point of injury until return. Now, in this perspective, a family of regression techniques known as survival models can be employed. And for the purpose of this webinar, the differences between the count and the continuous perspectives are fundamentally mathematical in nature. And for the purpose of this webinar, we can simply consider that the continuous perspective is practically applied using Weibull accelerated failure time models, a type of technique based on the form that I've shown here. Now, briefly, again, we can see that there are p observable determinants that go from xij to xip, again, representing sex, event type, items of that nature, or factors of that nature. And zi is a random effect, as in the Poisson case. Now, for interpretation here, the differential time spent injured is framed as quote-unquote accelerations or decelerations of injury recovery, and are basically computed based on the parameter estimates as exponents of the parameter terms attached to a given determinant. Now, once again, we see that the interpretation also accounts for the presence of the unobservable random effect, zi, which is used to, again, represent injury severity. Now, a simple demonstration of the sort of practical interpretation of AFT models for time loss is shown in this figure, where we see 2 hypothetical, what are called survival curves, representing the probability that a subject returns from injury at a given time point t, or beyond time point t, rather. So here, the survival curves, they're stratified by group for male and female players. And the survival curve suggests that about 75% of males will have returned from, this is hypothetical, from an injury at approximately time 1.4 or 1.5. Now, the same proportion of females will not have returned from injury until approximately time 4.2 or between 4.2 and 4.5. Now, which roughly translates to this acceleration factor that's illustrated here of about 3. So the exponents, what I was alluding to in the previous slide, is basically that the exponents of the parameter terms give us a sense of that acceleration factor and directly quantifies the lengthening or shortening of the duration of time spent injured. Now, I can understand that the framework that I presented can seem a bit abstract, so let's consider a practical example of a study that was conducted to essentially examine this framework. Now, in this study, we use a sample of soccer-related injury observations collected within the NCAA ISP, and the data were collected between 2004, 5, and 13, 14. Again, the primary objective here was to apply this framework and identify how a set of observable determinants predicted injury recovery in the sample while applying this framework. Now, in taking the count outcome approach with the Poisson models, we saw in general that injury site, injury mechanism, and injury history appear to have the strongest association with observed and measured time loss. Now, to orient you all to this figure, recall that I previously mentioned that time loss ratios could be estimated to express differential time loss between groups, essentially a ratio between the mean time loss for 2 groups. Now, given that this is a ratio, we can understand that equivalent mean time loss in 2 groups, with equivalent mean time loss in 2 groups, the resultant time loss ratio would be 1. Now, this would be considered the null value in this case and explains why there's essentially a vertical line going up the value of 1 in this graph. When the horizontal bar is attached to each comparison, which express essentially differential time loss. Now, when the horizontal bar is associated with a given time loss ratio does not touch the null value line, that estimate or that comparison, that difference is considered to be statistically significant. Now, those horizontal bars represent what are called 95% confidence limits. Coming back to the results, we see, for example, that in comparing time loss due to a hip or groin injury to time loss due to an ankle or foot injury in this sample, the time loss due to a hip or groin injury was significantly lower, approximately 22% in our calculations. Now, remember again that I mentioned previously that the latent injury severity was incorporated into this modeling framework. So when I say we're comparing hip or groin injuries to ankle or foot injuries, I'm also implying that comparisons are being made between injuries of similar, quote unquote, similar severity. Now, looking at some of the other observable determinants, we see that, again, expected time loss due to a contact injury was lower when compared to a similarly severe non-contact injury. And also, time loss due to a new injury was significantly lower than time loss due to a recurrent injury, again, of similar severity. Now, looking at the Weibull models or the survival model approach, we see that in general, again, the results appear to be comparable with those obtained from the Poisson model. After accounting for, again, latent injury severity using that random effect or the frailty term, injury site, injury mechanism, and injury history had the strongest association with time spent injured. Now, in these models, the estimated time spent injured was approximately 20% higher. It was higher for a knee injury as compared to an ankle or foot injury. Again, when you compared injuries at the same level of injury severity. Again, conversely, time spent injured was significantly lower by approximately 21% in our calculations for a hip or groin injury as compared to a similarly severe ankle or foot injury. As also we saw in the Poisson models, a non-contact injury was more deleterious in terms of time spent injured than a contact injury, approximately 19% based on our calculations, again, when you compared injuries at the same level or similar levels of injury severity. Also in this sample, new injuries again resulted in significantly less time spent injured as compared to similarly severe recurrent injuries. Now, to better understand the effect of incorporating this random effect, or incorporating the effect of latent injury severity, the unobservable injury severity, we also analyze using the same techniques, just removing or eliminating the random effect term or the latent injury severity term from our analyses. So we analyze these data by fitting the same Poisson and Weibull models, ignoring the latent injury severity. Now, in doing so, we observe that for the most part, the estimated fixed effects, again, the fixed effects represent associations between the observable determinants and observed and measured time loss. Those effects were attenuated when including the random effects. So, for example, the comparison between the knee and ankle foot injury site in the fixed effects only model yielded a larger differential time loss, approximately by 18%, than in the random effects model, the model that incorporated the latent injury severity. So again, what we're seeing is a bit of a bias in terms of expressing that association between observable determinants and time loss. Similarly, again, the comparison between D1 and D3 injuries and the fixed effects only model yielded a larger, approximately 22% larger differential time loss than the random effects model. Now, we saw similar results again when that was in discussing the Poisson models. We saw similar results when we were looking at the Weibull models as well, again, in comparing the fixed and random effects iterations. So, for example, we saw comparisons between the knee and ankle foot injury sites in the fixed effects model resulted approximately 18% larger estimated differential time spent injured than in the model incorporating latent injury severity. Now, we also saw that in the incorporation of this latent term, that this random effect term, tended to result in better fitting models. Now, I've presented some statistics here, which are essentially illustrations or indications of model fit. And the lower the value for a given family, the better. So we see that incorporation of the random effect tended to result in models that describe the data better. So in sum, we see that sports injury surveillance plays a pivotal role in informing injury prevention. Now, injury surveillance, as I mentioned, captures a large volume of data and can really be a valuable resource for information related to injury outcomes, in particular time loss, as we sort of went through in a detailed example. However, I'd say that in best utilizing surveillance data, it's important to align the nuances of injury surveillance and measurement with appropriately sophisticated and nuanced methods and analytical techniques, which perhaps arguably has not been historical practice. We've illustrated a specific example here with respect to time loss, where time loss in the context of injury surveillance may be really reframed as a reflection of the recovery process rather than a direct measure of injury severity, which has been historical practice. Now, the methods described here can be used to identify the most sort of powerful determinants of the recovery process in specific sporting contexts. Now, we discussed, again, in going through some of the details of that approach, we discussed some of the practical and inferential advantages of that proposed approach and the proposed different reframing. Now, and the reason why we sort of pay attention to these items and pay attention to methods is that ultimately it's important to note that from a scientific perspective, strong methods will always ultimately have downstream implications on informing stronger and better clinical programs. And looping back to what we started this webinar with, that's really ultimately the goal of scientists and public health practitioners in different spaces. To finish off, I'd like to note that much like any other scientific endeavor, the study I presented today, the specific data that I presented today, would not have been possible without the efforts of my many colleagues. I'd like to thank my colleagues and mentors at the institution where the work specifically was completed, the George Washington University, and acknowledge the efforts, of course, of my colleagues as well at the Datalys Center, as well as the many athletic trainers who participate in the sports injury surveillance mechanisms and make this work possible. Thank you, and I'll take questions now.
Great. Thank you, Avinash. What an interesting presentation. You know, we're really lucky. Normally, we get to hear about randomized clinical trials and observational studies, but we really haven't had too many of our brown bag presenters provide some epi data with such a direct application. So first, we want to thank you for being with us. I think at this point, Avinash is going to turn on his camera so everyone can put a name with a face. And I also want to mention that Avinash works at the Datalys Center, which is normally, when we're all in the National Center, it's housed in the same building with ACSM. And so we're always really thrilled to have our Datalys colleagues join us in any type of scientific endeavor. So this is great. So we have some questions, Avinash, some that are specific.
Sure. Just to clarify, can you see me? Do I need to be doing anything else with the screen?
Yeah, sorry, you're great. We can see you. Looks good. We have questions that are both specific to what you talked about, sport time loss from sport injury, and then we have some maybe a little bit more general questions about how sport injury surveillance is used. So sure. The first question we have is, we know that you have data from Division 1, 2, and 3 schools. Do you see a lot of difference between those schools as far as injury rates, types of injuries, time lost from injury, those sorts of types of things?
Mm-hmm. So that question has sort of multiple layers. It really sort of comes down to what specifically we're discussing in terms of a specific injury diagnosis, or if we're talking about a specific injury site or a particular type of injury. Yes, we do tend to see nuances between the divisions. I think what's really important to also consider in all of this is that we sample using different schools in these, and participating in these different divisions. So participation in the surveillance program also is heterogeneous between the divisions, which ultimately will have an impact on some of those divisional nuances that we see. But keeping that in mind, when we do standardize and look at rates over, let's say, 1,000 athlete exposures or 10,000 athlete exposures, we do see some differences between divisions as well. Again, important to note that the differences vary based on the specific diagnosis of interest or the specific injury condition that we're sort of talking about.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, you mentioned that the incoming data from athletic trainers is compared against the Datalys standard. Can you explain how the Datalys developed their standards?
So we use what are called a system of common data elements. So you can imagine, and athletic trainers at these institutions use clinical EMR software or platforms. So they're making records that don't really quite look like data sets that get analyzed for scientific purposes. So what happens on a background level is data from those EMR software are pushed to our systems. And then our technology partners, as well as us, we've come up with a core set of common data elements that would be extracted from those injury records or reports that are coming in from those EMR software. So those then get extracted and synthesized using a proprietary verification engine that we use, that our technology partners have crafted for us. And then that results in actually data tables that we analyze.
Excellent, thank you. One of our participants says, I may have missed it, but does the model take into account different treatment approaches?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because we're limited by, and this is, I think, earlier on in the presentation I'd mentioned, really the fundamental idea of surveillance is to cast a wide net, so to speak. So it's really breadth driven more so than it is depth driven. So we lose some granularity when it comes to specific details or specific items such as treatment modalities, right? So I mentioned that injury severity is sort of made up of all of these components, and treatment modalities and the aggressiveness of a particular treatment approach, it certainly feeds into that. Now, we're restricted when it comes to what is captured in surveillance, in sports injury surveillance with respect to treatments. We're essentially restricted down to looking at perhaps the most an indicator for an aggressive treatment modality such as surgery, so needing surgical intervention to repair an injury. So in my specific case, that was not incorporated into the multivariable models. However, some of my preliminary analyses did include them. It just was not included within my multivariable models for a couple of different reasons that are more sort of conceptual in nature, as well as sort of practical in nature, as I was alluding to.
Thank you. We're wondering, can you maybe talk just a little bit about the clinical application or translation of some of these results that you shared with us today?
Yeah, sure. So, ultimately, again, it comes down to specifically or most precisely identifying the effect or associations between observable determinants and an outcome of interest, right? So you can only direct resources based on where the empirical evidence suggests that the resources for a clinical rehabilitation and recovery programs should be directed. So first and foremost, it's extremely important to ensure that the effects that you're seeing between a given observable determinant and observed an outcome of interest is as precise as it can be. So then that drives attention towards, or directs attention towards, a specific area which can then sort of lead to more nuanced rehabilitation or recovery practices. So targeting either specific groups, targeting specific contexts, injuries that happen in specific settings, or specific types of injuries, or to specific to specific injury sites. All of those are reliant on getting the most precise estimation of those associations between those variables and the outcomes of interest.
Great. I think this next question sort of expands on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, given your soccer example, and everyone should know Avinash is an avid soccer player and coach, and we're going to get him involved in the indie soccer scene, hopefully. But given the soccer example, can you talk about the models used to assist in the development of ACL injury prevention programs and strategies for female athletes?
Mm-hmm.
Do you factor in some of the physiological factors that have been identified as risk factors?
Mm-hmm. So I think that that answer, there are two levels to that as well. So ultimately, the biggest, there's a level of what surveillance is and what surveillance can do. Then there's the other level of specific physiological factors that go into determining injury outcomes, the extent of an injury, all of those factors. And that's where I was sort of, if you remember, I had a figure initially of the cyclical process between large sample and small sample studies. So those, those interventions and those programs were developed following patterns that emerged in these large sample evaluations, which then resulted in looking at more specifically a particular group and evaluating the physiological characteristics of that group. Now, if you were to sort of take that and sort of, take the approach that I presented here and impose that, essentially, I said there were P observable determinants. Now, if you were to augment that list or replace that list with more precise physiological characteristics, because again, the variables that went into my models were very what we would consider broad brushstrokes. They're really larger buckets into which some of these physiological characteristics fall into. So sex differences or differences by competition level. We're making some inherent sort of implicit assumptions with respect to what those represent. And this question sort of directs into the more precise you get into those specific factors, the less you'll see sort of between subject variability. What you'll actually see is that you're chipping away at that because you're getting more and more precise into specifically the physiological characteristics that drive some of these observed outcomes, such as time loss. Now, with that said, I can't speak too much to the development of sort of ACL prevention programs, largely because I was not involved in them. But I do know that this is sort of the process that has gone on, is identifying an at-risk group or identifying patterns in large sample evaluations, and then getting into specific groups and trying to reconcile the physiological dynamics, the physiological characteristics within that group that are resulting in injury, potentially an injury risk, and then trying to correct those, intervene on those particular deleterious characteristics.
Great. You also showed in one of your figures that you were looking at data over time. When there are changes in the rules or changes in equipment, other things that could affect injuries? Did somehow that make that more difficult for you to look longitudinally at things, or can you describe how you control for that? For those of us who aren't as enmeshed in surveillance work, maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So actually, that's one of the ways in which we try to support the association is because surveillance is an ongoing process. We're able to sort of, evaluate what happens as naturally as as this dynamic process of rule changes come in. Now, we're also able to, and this is one of the greatest parts of being able to support the association, is we're able to use these data and empirically support decision making with respect to policies as well. Now, there are challenges, to answer your question about challenges specifically. There are challenges that are posed by when you try to collapse across eras or time periods without sort of accounting for those natural changes that have occurred either in the evolution of the game itself or the specific sport of interest, or in sort of rule changes that have come in along the way in different organizations that you're sort of following as part of the surveillance program. So there are challenges that come in when you try to synthesize all of that information, all of those data together, and then it's the fiduciary responsibility of a scientist to say, to acknowledge, or to understand, or at least note, comment on those potential factors that could explain some of those differences or that variability in observed injury risk or patterns in injury characteristics. But with that said, that is, we sort of also use the data and the naturally emerging patterns following or pre a rule change to actually sort of evaluate what's been effective, or how can we drive, or how can we inform policy a little bit better.
Well, that's a really good segue to our next question. So this is a two-parter. So for folks who aren't as familiar with some of the other data sets that are available that you and the Datalys group work on, could you maybe just very, very briefly describe NATION and RIO, and then could you talk to us about policy and governing bodies and how they use the information that you're generating to develop policies? I mean, do we have enough big data sets that you can inform policy?
So to answer the first part of that question about high school RIO and NATION, we operationally manage other surveillance systems as well, as I alluded to before at the Datalys Center. And from an operational perspective, they're comparable in the sense that there are athletic trainers at participating institutions that voluntarily contribute data into the surveillance system. For some, this involves sort of dual data entry, either within their clinical EMR systems, which may or may not be compatible with our systems. If that's the case, and that involves a little bit of dual data entry, or sort of similar process to what I described with the ISP, where we extract data from their EMR software. Now, in high school and in high school settings, it's more often than not that they're either using our proprietary software or platforms than not. But on the sort of analytical end, the process remains very comparable, where we extract this information based on these base elements, common data elements, and then we synthesize and analyze those data. Now, with respect to NATION in particular, one of the features or the nuances there are that there are different portals or different components to NATION as well, where we capture some treatment information and some other outcome information as well, which makes NATION a little bit unique to the NCAA ISP as well as to RIO. But from a functional perspective, they're quite comparable. Now, to your second question about supporting policy decision making, it's really difficult to answer that in with one uniform response, because it depends on the specific policy question at hand. So once you get into more nuanced or more sort of granular questions, then for some of those questions, we don't have the requisite data because we're asking about very specific instances or very specific occasions, and for which warrant potential sub-studies, which do happen as well. But for generally identifying overall patterns over time in injury rates or in general injury characteristics, we would certainly argue that there is, certainly with the NCAA ISP, we are at a place where participation is also robust, and we have a robust volume of data to inform sort of general injury characteristics and injury rates, or inform policy on general injury rates and injury characteristics.
Great. We have time for one more question. We would like to know, where are you disseminating your findings from your surveillance work? So I assume you have articles published in scholarly journals, but on the Datalys site or the NCAA website, where else can folks look to find some of the work, the findings of the work the results that you're generating?
Yeah, so there is, those are, you've named the sources where they are. First and foremost, it is, our funding agency, the NCAA, we support them with information, and it's to the discretion of the NCAA and the Sports Science Institute to sort of disseminate information to the extent that makes sense to them. With that said, in terms of readily accessible information from the Injury Surveillance Program, the place to point to is always peer-reviewed publications, and that's something that we make a concerted effort within the center as well as to constantly engage and make sure that the information is being disseminated to the larger scientific community. Using those outlets of peer-reviewed publications. So athletic training journals and sports medicine journals are really the place to find the highest fidelity and highest resolution information as it relates to the surveillance programs.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Avinash. This has been a really interesting presentation. It's been something different for us. I think we all understand a little bit more about sport injury surveillance and the importance of the work that you're doing. So with that, I'm going to say a huge thank you from ACSM. Again, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And for everyone participating at this point, we will end the webinar. Thank you.